talking about liquidating the sub now?
Yeah, liquidating sub.
Okay.
Yeah, we finished it. So, this is the situation where code section 332 applies. So, we have a sub-corp, and then we have a parent corp. In this situation, we have the sub is liquidating and distributing the assets up to the parent. So, this is an exception. Why is this an exception? Well, because the assets, if you think about it, aren't really changing hands, right? We're really just going from the parent owning the sub and the sub owning all the assets to now the parent owning all the assets. So since we really just have a change in form, we have these exceptions under code section 332 and 337. 332 applies to the shareholder or the parent, basically. 337 applies to the distributing corp or the sub in our fact pattern. So, let's take a look at 332 first. 332 says, no gain or loss shall be recognized on the receipt by a corporation of property distributed in complete liquidation of another corporation. So, on the receipt by a corporation of property distributed from another corporation. So, certain conditions have to be met for code section 332 to apply. And if you look under code section 332B, it tells you what these conditions are. We basically have under 332, no gain or loss to recognize by the parent shareholder if control is met and timing is met. So what is control? Well, let's take a look under B1. The corporation receiving such property was on the date of the adoption of the plan of liquidation, this is on page 54, and has continued to be at all times until the receipt of the property, the owner of such corp meeting the requirements of section 1504A2. 1504A2. Now, do you guys remember back when we were talking in chapter 2 about the control test under 351? That control test took you to code section 368C. Note, we have a control test, but the code says go to 1504A2. Another perfect example. Same word in the code. We're testing control, but we're taking you to a different code section which has a different test for control. Okay, perfect example. Just because we're testing control does not mean we have the same control test that we looked at under code section 351. In fact, we have a different one. Instead of going to code section 368C, we're going to 1504A2, which is actually the rules for consolidated returns. But we go to our book, 1504A2. (1504A2) says, the ownership of stock of any corporation meets the requirements of this paragraph if it possesses at least 80% of the total voting power and has a value equal to at least 80% of the total value of the stock of such corporation. So we have an 80% vote and value test. At least 80% vote and value. That is different from the control test under 351, which I can't remember. It was 80% vote, but then it was also 80% of all classes of non-voting shares. So this is a different test, 80% vote invalid. Okay, so now let's look at the timing rules, which are found under 332B2 and B3. So these are our timing rules. The distribution is by such other, I'm not going to read it, that's too long. I'm just going to abbreviate it. It's on page 15 in my outline book if you want to look at the timing. If it's a one-shot liquidation, if the subsidiary distributes all of its assets within one taxable year, even if it's not in the same year in which the liquidation plan is adopted. Okay? So, timing within 1 year. All distributions are complete. Or, if it's not within 1 year, the plan must provide that the subsidiary will transfer all of its property within 3 years after the close of the tax year in which the first distribution is made. Within 3 years after close of tax year of the first distribution. So we have to meet this control test and the timing test in order for the shareholder to receive non-recognition treatment on this liquidation. Okay? Now, note, this is important, this code section only applies if the shareholder owns at least 80% vote in value. So, what happens if we have parents here and they own 80%, but then we also have another corporation, or it can be an individual, somebody else, we'll just say G, that owns 20%. Is this code section going to apply to this minority shareholder? No, it will not. So what rules are we going to be under for the minority shareholder? The rules we just talked about, right? The rules we just talked about, 331. So the minority shareholders, okay, are going to fall under the rules in 331, which basically allow them to recognize gain, or allow or require gain and loss. Right? These are the rules for the shareholder. Okay. Now, let's talk about the consequences to S, the liquidating subsidiary, which is found in Code Section 337. I'm trying to figure out where I want to write it. This is 332. And the 337 says the liquidating corp, or the sub, recognizes no gain or loss from a shareholder qualifying under 332. This is in code section 337. And it's not a very long, it's not a very long code section, but it says no gain or loss shall be recognized to the liquidating corporation on the distribution to the 80% distributee. Okay? Recognizes no gain or loss to the 332 shareholder, I'll say. Okay? So, so what does that mean? If we have a distribution, hold on a second. Okay. That's right. 336D3. Let's take a look, D3. It says under 336D3, I have here starred at the bottom on page 57, because I sometimes forget about this rule. Special rule in case of liquidation to which section 332 applies. No loss shall be recognized to the liquidating corporation on any distribution in such liquidation. It shall apply to any distribution to only if subsection A and B of section 337 applies to such distribution. So what this means is, if you have a minority shareholder, the shareholder is going to get to recognize gain or loss. But the distributing corporation, okay, is going to have to recognize gain, but unfortunately there is no such rule in the code that allows them to recognize loss. So the distributing corp, or the sub, has to recognize gain for what's distributed to the minority shareholder, but they cannot recognize loss for the piece distributed to the minority shareholder. Okay, so let's do a problem. And then, yeah, we'll do a problem. Problem page 353. I think. Is here now? Yeah, page 353. Let's look at problem 1. Okay. I'll do it right here. Okay, so in this problem, we have parent who owns 90% of sub, and then we have I who owns 10%. I has a $200 basis in its shares in S, and P has a $3,000 basis in its shares in S. Okay, they have 3 assets. Okay, so we have land, which has a $3K basis and an $8K fair market value. We have equipment, which has a $2,500 basis and a $1K fair market value. We have inventory, which has a $100 basis and a $1,000 fair market value. Okay, so I'm gonna erase this right here. Because I've run out of room. So, if we look at problem A, S distributes the inventory to I and the other assets to P. So, we have inventory going to I, and then all else is going to P. So, let's look at P first. S is liquidating. So, P has a $3,000 basis in its shares and is receiving basically $9,000 in property, right? $9,000 in property. So, how much gain is P going to realize? So, we have $9,000 in amount realized minus a $3,000 basis equals $6,000 in gain realized. All right? How much gain is P going to recognize?
0.
Yes, that's right. 0 gain recognized because of code section 332, which is an exception. Okay? Now, what about S? S is basically distributing the land and the equipment to P. So, S is basically going to not recognize any gain for the equipment and the inventory. So S is going to have no gain recognition. Well, they'll have, let's see, S has $5,000 of gain realized from the land, and we have a $1,500 loss realized, but again, $0 recognized for both the loss and the gain, because it's going to fall under code section 337. So, now, what is going to be P's basis in the land and the equipment? They're basically, I guess I didn't mention this earlier, but S is going to have a carryover basis in the land and the equipment. We're basically just deferring any gain or any loss. Just carrying it over, similar to what we do under code section 351, another non-recognition transaction. You may be seeing a trend. If we have a non-recognition rule, like code section 351, like code section 332, yes, you get non-recognition, but you have a carryover basis in the properties. Basically, all we're doing is deferring the gain or the loss until the properties are sold later. Okay, so now let's talk about I. Okay, so I is a minority shareholder, right? So these rules under 332 and 337 are not going to apply to him. So what's going to be I's amount realized? $1,000, right? Minus his basis in his shares, right, of $200 equals $800 of gain realized. How much gain is recognized? $800. What about the corporation? So we have S under this distribution to I. Their value is, again, $1,000. minus a basis in the inventory of 100, which equals a $900 gain realized and recognized for the corporation. Okay. All right. Now, let's take a look at giving the equipment to I and all else is to P. So now we have the equipment to I. So the tax consequences for P are going to essentially be the same, right? Non-recognition rules for the land and the inventory. I'm not going to draw that out again, okay? It's the same. Non-recognition carryover basis for these assets that go to P. But now we have equipment going to I. So we have I receiving $1,000 in value. So we have an amount realized to I of $1,000 minus the $200 basis equals $800 of gain. And now we have S's side, which has a $1,500 loss. Is this recognized?
Yeah.
No. Distributing corp sub can't recognize loss if it's distributed to a minority shareholder. Can't recognize the loss if it's distributed to a majority shareholder under 337 because they can't recognize gain or loss. Realize, and then this is disallowed. Okay, now C, let's see here. What result in B above if P's basis in its S stock were $30,000 and S had a $30,000 basis in the land? I's basis was what? If P's basis in S, P's basis in its S stock was $30,000. Okay, so since this one doesn't really change the tax consequences for I, I'm gonna erase I. So what we're saying in this one, since we're talking about the tax consequences to P, P has a $30,000 basis and is receiving, basically he's going to receive land and inventory. So he's receiving the land and the inventory. So he's receiving $9,000 of value and has a $30,000 basis. So P is receiving $9,000 in amount realized minus a $30,000 basis, which equals $21,000 loss realized. So this is, of course, zero recognized, right? Because under the rules under 337 or 332, no gain or loss is recognized. What they're trying to get you to see, and it is a very important point that I want you guys to look at. What happens to this $30,000 that P has in its basis in S? What happens to it? It just disappears. It's known as the disappearing basis. Because you essentially, S is no longer in existence after this liquidation, right? So P had $30,000 of basis in S, receives a loss with this distribution. So their $30,000 investment in this company is just gone. They don't get any tax benefit from it now or in the future. It is a very bad tax consequence, and it's known as the disappearing basis. This is not an instance of deferral. We talk about deferral all over the place, because this basis is permanently gone. Now, when we're talking about S, they basically are also, they have a $22,000 loss in the land that they are not going to be able to recognize. This loss, I mean, they don't get to recognize it really ever. Because if you will remember, what is, well, I guess they will, because P's basis, we're going to have a carryover basis of $30,000. So if eventually P sells it, they will have that basis. So the loss is still preserved. So we do still have a preserved loss in the asset, but that basis is gone. The basis in S. Okay. Last question. Is C above a situation where P might wish to avoid the application of 332? What do you all think? Yes, this is bad, right? This is bad. He's basically losing out on $30,000 worth of investment is gone, no tax benefit. So it says, okay, what are some ways that you could get around this? What are some ways that, you guys could see, where this wouldn't be an issue? So to fall under 332, what are the two requirements you have to have? Control and timing. So what could P do to manipulate those requirements?
They call it distributions in a year. Or outside, sorry.
Outside of the 3-year window,
Yeah.
right? Exactly, there's one. Make all the, keep it going, span it out of past 3 years. What else could they do? What do y'all think? So the control requirement, what does the control requirement say? What's the ownership percentage? 80. So what could they do? Sell, so they don't have 80%. And I can tell you when I worked at PwC, I worked in M&A and international tax, and this code section gave people a lot of grief. They did not want to fall under this code section a lot of the time. And that's one of the tactics people would use is like sell under 80%. There can be problems with that from an international tax perspective. You may need 80%. Or if you're talking about a consolidated return, you may need 80%. But there's some ways to get around it. Or you could, so this is a lost asset, right? What if S sold the asset to a third party first and then distributed the cash up to P? Well, that would help with the loss in the land, but it's still not going to help with P's basis in S. So, okay. That's it on this chapter. I'm not going to go ahead and go to the next stuff. So we'll just pick up what that stuff next time. Are there any questions on this? It's not hard. You just have to make sure you're looking at the code and following all the little